The Whispering Chair. In a quaint village nestled amidst mist-covered hills, there was a house everyone spoke of in hushed tones. Its name was Willow Manor, a grand yet foreboding structure that had stood for centuries. At its heart lay the dining room, and within that room, an antique chair, the Whispering Chair, rested in eerie silence, shrouded in an air of unease. Legend had it that anyone who sat on the chair would hear whispers that grew louder and more insistent over time, urging them to stay seated. Those who ignored the whispers and left the chair were never seen again. Over the years, the house had been abandoned, but the stories lived on, passed down like a dark inheritance. The Inheritance. Claire Martin was a young woman who had grown tired of her monotonous city life. When she received a letter from a distant relative's lawyer informing her of an unexpected inheritance, she saw it as an opportunity for a fresh start. Her great-uncle, whom she had never met, had left her Willow Manor. Despite warnings from locals, Claire dismissed stories about the chair as nothing more than superstitious nonsense. Upon arriving at Willow Manor, Claire was captivated by its old-world charm. The dining room was the most striking of all. High vaulted ceilings, a grand chandelier, and an imposing oak table with intricately carved chairs. Among them, one stood out. The Whispering Chair had a high back adorned with elaborate carvings that seemed to depict faces twisted in silent screams. It drew Claire's gaze with an inexplicable magnetism. Ignoring the unease that prickled at the edge of her senses, Claire decided to renovate the manor. She worked tirelessly over the next few weeks, restoring its former glory. However, no matter how much she tried, she couldn't bring herself to move the Whispering Chair. It felt wrong, as though the chair belonged precisely where it was. The first whispers. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of crimson and gold, Claire decided to sit at the dining table and savor a quiet dinner. Without realizing it, she chose the Whispering Chair. As she leaned back, a chill ran down her spine, and she thought she heard a faint whisper. She froze, straining to listen, but all she heard was the distant hoot of an owl. Shrugging it off, she finished her meal and retired for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. The whispers followed her, faint yet persistent, like a voice carried on the wind. "Stay, stay," the voice murmured, growing louder as the hours passed. Claire awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. She convinced herself it was just her imagination, fueled by the stories she'd heard. But the next day, the whispers persisted, not just at night, but during the day as well. They seemed to emanate from the dining room, growing louder whenever she passed by. A cry for help. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Claire began researching the history of Willow Manor. She visited the local library and unearthed old records about the house. She discovered that the chair had been crafted by a woodworker named Elias Moore over 2 centuries ago. Elias was known for his extraordinary skill, but also for his dark and reclusive nature. Rumors suggested he had dabbled in forbidden rituals, infusing his creations with a part of himself. Claire found a faded photograph of Elias, his piercing eyes staring directly into the camera as though he could see beyond time. She also uncovered records of families who had lived in Willow Manor, all of whom had met tragic ends. The last entry chilled her to the bone. The Martins, 1947, disappeared without a trace after a dinner party. Only the chair remained, untouched. The name struck her like a thunderclap. These Martins were her ancestors. The binding ritual. Unable to ignore the whispers any longer, Claire decided to confront the chair. She lit candles around the room, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. She sat on the whispering chair once more, determined to face whatever haunted it. The whispers grew louder, forming words she could finally understand. "Free me? Please," they begged, the voice trembling with desperation. Claire felt a wave of sorrow and terror wash over her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quivering. The whispers coalesced into a single voice. "I am Elias Moore, bound to this chair by my own folly. My soul is trapped, cursed to torment anyone who sits here." Claire's heart raced. She asked, "How can I free you?" "Burn it," Elias's voice replied, "but beware, the chair will not let go easily. It will fight to survive." The struggle. Claire gathered the courage to destroy the chair. She dragged it to the backyard and poured kerosene over it. As she struck the match, a violent wind rose, extinguishing the flame. The chair began to tremble, the carvings on its surface shifting as though alive. Faces emerged from the wood, screaming silently. A shadowy figure appeared behind Claire, a manifestation of Elias's tormented soul. His face was a mask of anguish, his form barely distinguishable from the darkness. He raised a spectral hand, pointing at the chair. "Do not stop," Elias's voice urged. "You must finish this." Claire struck another match, shielding it from the wind. This time, the flames caught, licking hungrily at the wood. The chair let out a high-pitched wail, an unearthly sound that echoed through the night. The carvings melted away, and with them, the whispers ceased. A new beginning. When the fire died down, nothing remained of the whispering chair but ashes. The air felt lighter. The oppressive atmosphere of the manor lifted. Claire felt a profound sense of relief, as though a heavy weight had been removed from her shoulders. Over time, she transformed Willow Manor into a warm and welcoming home. The villagers, once fearful, began to visit, drawn by Claire's kindness and the house's newfound charm. The legend of the whispering chair faded into memory, replaced by tales of a brave woman who dared to confront the darkness. But late at night, when the wind howled through the hills, some claimed to hear faint whispers carried on the breeze. And Claire, though she never admitted it, sometimes felt a presence watching over her, a quiet guardian ensuring the curse never returned. The Soup of Shadows. In the heart of an old, misty village nestled between mountains, there was a peculiar legend that was whispered among the townsfolk. It was the tale of the Soup of Shadows, a dish said to bring both a curse and a blessing. But only those who dared venture into the darkness of the unknown would come to understand its true nature. This is the story of that dish, and how a simple, unassuming man came to learn the terrible price it demanded. The village of Karoth was like any other. Quiet, peaceful, unremarkable even. But if you spent enough time with the people, they'd eventually tell you about the shadowy corners of their town, the places where the air grew heavy and the sunlight barely reached. This was where the tale of the Soup of Shadows had begun. One evening, as the village was bathed in the golden hues of a setting sun, a man named Elias arrived in Karoth. He was a wanderer, no family, no home, no particular destination. He had been traveling for weeks, seeking a place to settle, though none had ever felt right. Something about Karoth seemed to call out to him, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. Perhaps it was the way the village's air felt thick with mystery, or the fact that despite its quiet nature, the townsfolk seemed to carry a weight, an unspoken secret they dared not share. Elias, curious by nature, could sense there was something different about this village. He arrived at the small inn at the edge of town, an old, creaky structure with faded wooden walls and a sign that read, "The Starlight Inn." The innkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a cautious smile, greeted him warmly. "Looking for a place to stay, traveler?" she asked, her voice as soft as a whisper. Yes, just for the night, Elias replied, glancing around the dimly lit interior. There was something unsettling about the place, but it was exactly what he needed after days of walking. Of course, she said. But before you settle in, I must tell you something. We don't take kindly to those who ask too many questions around here. There are things in this village, things better left undisturbed. Elias raised an eyebrow. I'm just passing through, he said with a half-hearted smile. I won't be here long. The innkeeper's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Elias thought he saw a flicker of something ancient in them, a knowledge of things far beyond his understanding. She handed him the key to his room and said, Remember, the soup of shadows is not for the unworthy. He nodded, unsure of what she meant, but the word stayed with him. That night, as he sat in his room, the winds howling outside, Elias couldn't help but overhear fragments of conversation from the bar below. The locals spoke in hushed tones, mentioning the soup of shadows and how it had haunted the village for generations. Intrigued, Elias couldn't resist.
The woman took a ladle and dipped it into the cauldron, pulling out a dark, swirling liquid that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. She poured it into a wooden bowl and handed it to Elias. Drink, and your wish will be granted. But know this, nothing comes without a cost. Elias stared at the soup, the shadows inside it twisting and writhing as if alive. He could feel the pull, the temptation. Without hesitation, he took the bowl and drank it all in one go. At first, nothing happened. The taste was strange, bitter, like ash, but with a richness that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't known in years. But then the room began to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and contorted. The walls seemed to breathe, and Elias felt a terrible weight settle on his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The shadows were inside him now. He staggered back, clutching his throat, gasping for air. The woman stood in the corner, watching him with hollow eyes, as if waiting for the inevitable. Elias stumbled out of the shack, but the shadows followed him, twisting in the air, crawling along the ground like tendrils. The villagers watched him as he walked through the streets, their faces pale with fear. They knew what had happened. They knew the price. As the days passed, Elias began to change. He could feel the shadows growing stronger inside him, eating away at his mind. They whispered to him in his sleep, showing him visions of the past, the future, and things that should not have been. He saw his deepest fears, his darkest desires, things he could not unsee. And then one night, as he lay in his bed, the shadows rose from the walls. They surrounded him, suffocating him. He heard their voices in his ears, the voices of the forgotten, the lost souls who had been consumed by the soup before him. They spoke of his fate, how he would never escape the darkness, how he would become part of the soup, lost to time forever. Elias had become what he feared most, a shadow. His soul was gone, consumed by the darkness he had sought so eagerly. The soup of shadows had claimed him, just as it claimed all those before him. And so, the legend continued, whispered from generation to generation, a warning to those who dared to seek out the cursed dish. For in the end, no one who drank from the soup of shadows ever truly survived. The villagers tell the story, and the shadows whisper it to anyone who will listen. But few ever truly understand the price until they are standing at the edge, ready to take the first sip. And by then, it is always too late.
The next morning, he ventured out to the village square, where an old man sat on a bench, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He had the look of someone who had seen far too much in his time. Elias approached him, careful not to seem too eager. I've heard whispers about a soup, Elias began, his voice casual, something special about it. The old man looked up at him with sharp, calculating eyes. "Ah," he said softly, "the soup of shadows. You've heard the tale then. Few do, and even fewer survive to tell it." Elias sat down beside him, the weight of the conversation suddenly pressing down on his chest. "What is it?" The old man sighed, as if the answer was one he had given 1,000 times but was weary of. "It's a dish that is said to have the power to grant any wish, a single selfish desire. But there's a price, young man, a price that none can truly escape." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The soup is made from ingredients that grow in the dark places, where the sun never shines. It's not like anything you've ever tasted. It's said to hold the essence of shadows themselves, secrets, fears, forgotten dreams. The shadows in the soup will show you things you wish you never saw. But the most terrible part is, once you drink it, you cannot go back. The shadows begin to follow you, to haunt you. You become part of the soup." Elias shuddered, but his curiosity only deepened. "Have you ever tried it?" The old man gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Once, long ago, I was young, foolish, and hungry for power. It granted me a single wish, just as it does for all who dare to seek it. But the price was worse than death." Elias leaned forward. "What was the price?" The old man's face twisted into a grimace, and he looked around nervously, as if the shadows themselves might be listening. "It took my soul, piece by piece. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. The soup, the shadows, the darkness that has consumed me. I can never escape. You won't either." Elias didn't know whether to laugh or to run. But something about the old man's words stirred something deep inside him. The legend was real. The soup was real. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the village, just outside a small, dilapidated shack that was rumored to be the home of the last person known to have made the soup of shadows. He knocked softly on the door, and after a long silence, it creaked open. A thin, gaunt woman stood in the doorway, her eyes sunken and hollow. She stared at Elias for a long moment before stepping aside and allowing him in. "You're here for the soup," she said, her voice almost a croak. "You think you can handle it, but you don't know what it will cost you." Elias nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I've heard the stories. I want to see if they're true."
The Haunted Mirror. In the heart of a forgotten town stood an old, crumbling mansion, its walls weathered by time and decay, and its windows covered by thick layers of dust. The mansion had been empty for years, its once grand halls now silent, save for the echoes of memories long gone. Yet, despite the mansion's desolation, there was one object that remained undisturbed in the heart of the home: a mirror. This was no ordinary mirror. It was said that the mirror had been passed down through generations, from one family to the next. The origins of the mirror were unknown, shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was a gift from a faraway land, while others whispered that it had been created by an ancient sorcerer. The truth, however, was far darker than anyone could imagine. It all began with the arrival of Emily, the young woman eager to escape the noise and chaos of city life. Emily had heard rumors about the mansion. She had heard whispers in the town about its eerie reputation, but she had never believed in such things. A practical, down-to-earth woman, she was determined to make a new start, and the mansion, with its grand yet forsaken charm, seemed like the perfect place to call home. Emily had been searching for a place to settle for months, and when she came across the mansion for rent, she saw only opportunity. The rent was unbelievably low, and the owner, a distant relative who had inherited the estate, was more than eager to lease the property. "You'll love it," he said, a strange, distant smile on his face as he handed her the keys. The mansion stood alone on a hill, surrounded by overgrown gardens and the shadows of tall, ancient trees. The moment Emily stepped inside, she felt a strange chill, as if the house was waiting for something or someone. It was an old building, its once elegant interiors now faded and forgotten. Dust covered every surface, and the air felt thick, almost stagnant. But Emily was not easily scared. She walked through the grand entrance and began to explore, each room more desolate than the last. She wandered from room to room, imagining how the mansion would look once she cleaned it up, making it her own. In one of the rooms, she found it. The mirror. It was an ancient, full-length mirror, its frame carved from dark, ornate wood. The surface was smooth, despite the layers of dust that had gathered over time. The glass seemed to shimmer slightly, almost as if it were alive, though Emily dismissed it as a trick of the light. She wiped the dust from its surface, revealing intricate designs etched into the frame, symbols she did not recognize. Something about the mirror felt different, though. As she gazed into its reflection, she couldn't help but notice that the room around her seemed to fade, as though the mirror was pulling her into another world. The reflection of the room appeared to be distorted, the walls stretching and warping. Emily stepped closer to inspect the mirror, but the sensation faded as quickly as it had come. Shaking her head, she convinced herself it was simply her imagination playing tricks on her. Over the following days, Emily continued to clean and renovate the mansion. But no matter how much she worked, she found herself drawn back to the mirror. It was as though it was calling to her, beckoning her to look into it again. There was a strange compulsion to stand before it, to peer into its depths, and each time she noticed something new, something unsettling. At night, Emily would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. She thought she had heard faint whispers from the mirror, but when she checked, the room was always silent. It was the kind of silence that made her skin crawl. Every time she passed the mirror, she couldn't help but glance into it, only to find her reflection staring back at her with eyes that seemed different. Her own face looked pale, almost gaunt, and her eyes had a haunted look that didn't belong to her. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. At times, she would hear faint footsteps behind her, only to turn around and find no one there. Objects in the mansion would move by themselves, small things at first, like books shifting on shelves or a chair that seemed to inch across the floor. But then the occurrences became more sinister. One evening, as Emily sat in the living room, a strange coldness settled over the house. The warmth of the fire in the hearth could not dispel it. She stood up, her heart pounding, and walked toward the source of the chill. It was the mirror again. The glass seemed to ripple, its surface distorting as if it were not made of solid glass, but some kind of liquid. Emily felt a pull, an almost magnetic force drawing her toward it. She stepped closer, her breath shallow, her body trembling. In the reflection, she saw not only herself, but a figure standing behind her. Tall, dark, and shadowy. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her pulse quickened, and she stepped back, her mind racing. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? The mirror had begun to show things that weren't there, or perhaps things that she could not yet comprehend. It showed faces, pale, twisted faces that stared back at her from the depths of the glass. The longer she looked, the more the reflection seemed to shift, revealing glimpses of other rooms in the house, rooms she had never seen, rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The faces grew clearer, and Emily could swear she saw them moving within the mirror, their eyes following her every move. The woman took a ladle and dipped it into the cauldron, pulling out a dark, swirling liquid that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. She poured it into a wooden bowl and handed it to Elias. "Drink, and your wish will be granted. But know this, nothing comes without a cost." Elias stared at the soup, the shadows inside it twisting and writhing as if alive. He could feel the pull, the temptation. Without hesitation, he took the bowl and drank it all in one go. At first, nothing happened. The taste was strange, bitter, like ash, but with a richness that made him feel alive in a way he hadn't known in years. But then the room began to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and contorted. The walls seemed to breathe, and Elias felt a terrible weight settle on his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The shadows were inside him now. He staggered back, clutching his throat, gasping for air. The woman stood in the corner, watching him with hollow eyes, as if waiting for the inevitable. Elias stumbled out of the shack, but the shadows followed him, twisting in the air, crawling along the ground like tendrils. The villagers watched him as he walked through the streets, their faces pale with fear. They knew what had happened. They knew the price. As the days passed, Elias began to change. He could feel the shadows growing stronger inside him, eating away at his mind. They whispered to him in his sleep, showing him visions of the past, the future, and things that should not have been. He saw his deepest fears, his darkest desires, things he could not unsee. And then one night, as he lay in his bed, the shadows rose from the walls. They surrounded him, suffocating him. He heard their voices in his ears, the voices of the forgotten, the lost souls who had been consumed by the soup before him. They spoke of his fate, how he would never escape the darkness, how he would become part of the soup, lost to time forever. Elias had become what he feared most, a shadow. His soul was gone, consumed by the darkness he had sought so eagerly. The soup of shadows had claimed him, just as it claimed all those before him. And so, the legend continued, whispered from generation to generation, a warning to those who dared to seek out the cursed dish. For in the end, no one who drank from the soup of shadows ever truly survived. The villagers tell the story, and the shadows whisper it to anyone who will listen. But few ever truly understand the price until they are standing at the edge, ready to take the first sip. And by then, it is always too late. Unable to tear herself away from the glass, Emily watched in horror as the faces grew more distinct. They were not strangers. They were people she knew, but in distorted, nightmarish forms. Her parents, her friends, her own face, twisted, elongated, and broken, were all staring at her from within the mirror. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder. The voice, a low, rasping sound, came from within the mirror itself. "You should never have come here," the voice croaked. "You cannot escape once you've looked into it." Emily stumbled back, her hands shaking. The house seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing in on her. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, their forms shifting and contorting as if they were alive. She could feel the air growing thick with an oppressive presence, a malevolent force that she could not escape. Desperate to break free, Emily turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut in front of her, trapping her inside. The mirror shimmered, and she could see herself trapped within it, her reflection smiling at her in a twisted mockery. Her eyes grew wide with terror as she realized she was no longer in control of her own body. The mirror had taken her. Panicked, she scrambled to break the glass, but it was no use. Her reflection moved on its own, grinning at her as it slowly reached out of the mirror. The shadows around her thickened, pressing in from all sides. In that moment, she understood the true nature of the mirror. It was a portal, a gateway to a world of darkness. It didn't just reflect the world, it absorbed souls, pulling them into its depths and trapping them forever. The faces that she saw in the mirror were not her own, but the souls of those who had gazed into its depths before her, each one forever imprisoned in the glass. The last thing Emily saw before the mirror swallowed her whole was her own face, twisted in agony, trapped forever within the dark, reflective surface. Years passed, and the mansion remained untouched, the mirror still hanging in its place. No one dared enter the house, not after the rumors of its haunted past spread throughout the town. The legend of the mirror grew, and the stories of Emily's disappearance faded into whispers, forgotten by all but a few. But the mirror remained, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to gaze into its depths. For as long as the mirror existed, the cycle would continue. It would always take more. And somewhere deep within the reflection, Emily's face still lingered, trapped forever, her eyes pleading for someone to save her from the cursed glass. But no one ever came. The dinner guest. On a cold, moonlit night, the old house at the edge of the forest sat in eerie silence. Known to locals as Blackwood Manor, it had a sinister reputation. People whispered tales of strange happenings, of lights flickering in its windows when no one was home, of voices drifting through the air at night. Yet the house wasn't empty. It belonged to Evelyn, a reclusive writer who had moved in 6 months earlier. Evelyn had bought the house in a moment of spontaneity, captivated by its Gothic charm. She loved the solitude, the isolation. It gave her the peace she needed to write. But as the months passed, she began to feel less alone. It wasn't anything she could pinpoint. A shadow that seemed to move when it shouldn't, the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway when she was certain she was alone. She dismissed it as her imagination. After all, she was a writer. Stories were her life. One evening, as the first snow of winter blanketed the ground, Evelyn decided to take a break from her work. She lit the fireplace in the grand dining room, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. The long, mahogany table, which could seat 10, was empty save for her single-place setting. She poured herself a glass of wine, served her modest dinner, and sat down to eat. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Evelyn shivered and glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. Its hands read 8:47 p.m. She took a sip of her wine and reached for her fork when she heard it. A soft knock at the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. Who would be visiting at this hour, in the middle of a snowstorm? The nearest neighbor was miles away. Evelyn hesitated, debating whether to ignore it. But the knock came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, she rose from her chair, her footsteps echoing in the silent house as she made her way to the front door. She opened it cautiously, and there, standing on the snow-covered porch, was a man. He was tall, his frame thin and angular, wrapped in an old-fashioned black coat. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his dark eyes seemed to pierce through her. He held no umbrella, yet not a single flake of snow clung to him. "I'm sorry to disturb you," the man said in a smooth, almost melodic voice. "My car broke down nearby, and the storm caught me off guard. Might I come in to warm myself?" Evelyn hesitated. There was something unsettling about the man, something she couldn't quite put into words. But it was freezing outside, and she couldn't just leave him there. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. "Come in." The man stepped into the house, his boots leaving no trace of snow on the floor. Evelyn led him to the dining room, where the fire still burned brightly. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the table. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Tea?" "Wine will do, thank you," he replied with a faint smile. Evelyn poured him a glass of red wine and watched as he took a seat at the table. He moved with an unnatural grace, as though he were gliding rather than walking. She sat across from him, her unease growing. "Do you live here alone?" the man asked, his dark eyes fixed on her. "Yes," she replied, forcing a smile. "It's quiet, but I like it that way. It helps me focus on my writing." "A writer," the man said, his smile widening. "How fascinating. And what do you write about?" Evelyn hesitated. "Mostly mysteries. Sometimes thrillers." "Ah," the man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You must enjoy delving into the unknown, unraveling secrets. Tell me, Evelyn, do you ever feel as though you've written something that shouldn't exist?" Her blood ran cold. She hadn't told him her name. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "It was written all over the house," he said cryptically. "The books, the notes on your desk. A writer leaves traces of herself everywhere." Evelyn tried to calm her racing heart. Perhaps he'd seen her name in passing, nothing more. But something about his presence made her feel as though the walls were closing in. The fire crackled, and for a moment the room fell silent. Then the man spoke again. "This house has a history, you know. Do you know what happened here?" Evelyn shook her head. She had heard rumors, of course, but she had never believed in ghost stories. "No," she said, "I don't." The man leaned forward, his dark eyes gleaming in the firelight. "A family once lived here. They were well-liked, respected in the community. But one winter night, much like this one, something happened. The family invited a guest for dinner, a stranger who had come knocking at their door. By morning, the family was dead, and the guest was gone." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. She forced a nervous laugh. "That's just a story," she said, "an old legend." "Is it?" the man said, his voice as smooth as silk. "Or is it a warning?" Evelyn stood abruptly. "I think you should leave." The man didn't move. "I'm afraid I can't do that," he said, his voice growing colder. "You invited me in, Evelyn, and now I'm your guest." The lights flickered and the air grew heavy. Evelyn backed away from the table, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The man's features began to change, his pale skin growing even paler, his eyes darkening into empty voids. Shadows seemed to gather around him, stretching across the room like grasping fingers. Evelyn turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She didn't look back, but she could feel him following, his presence pressing down on her like a weight. She fled to her study, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she grabbed her phone to call for help. But the screen was dead, no signal, no light. The doorknob rattled, and then there was a knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "Evelyn," the man's voice called, muffled through the door. "You can't hide from me. You invited me in, remember? A guest must always be entertained." The door creaked open, and the man stepped inside, his form now a dark, swirling mass of shadow and malice. Evelyn backed into the corner, her eyes wide with terror. "Why are you doing this?" she cried. The man's voice was no longer human. It was deep, resonant, and otherworldly. "Because I hunger, Evelyn, and you are my feast." The shadows engulfed her, and the last thing she saw was the man's smile, wide and cruel, as darkness consumed her. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the house stood silent once more. Evelyn was gone, her place at the table empty, her wine glass untouched. In the center of the dining table sat a single-place setting, pristine and undisturbed. And in the quiet of the house, a faint knock echoed from the front door, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to answer. The never-ending feast. It was a cold autumn evening when Nathan received the invitation. It came in an envelope so thick and ornate it felt like a relic from a different century. The paper was ivory, and the ink shimmered faintly in the dim light of his kitchen. The message was short but intriguing. You are cordially invited to the Feast of Eternity, Saturday, 8 p.m. The Ivory Hall. Come hungry. Nathan stared at the invitation, confused. He couldn't recall signing up for anything like this, nor could he remember ever hearing about the Ivory Hall. The address, written in an elegant script, was unfamiliar, but curiosity tugged at him. Nathan had a taste for adventure, for the unusual, and this invitation seemed like an opportunity he couldn't pass up. On Saturday evening, he donned his best suit, an outfit that had gathered dust in his closet for months. The address led him to a grand estate on the outskirts of town, hidden behind tall iron gates. The building was a sprawling mansion, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. The surrounding forest was dark, the wind whispering through the trees, adding to the ominous atmosphere. Nathan hesitated at the gate, but as if sensing his presence, it creaked open slowly. He stepped onto the gravel path, his footsteps crunching in the silence. The closer he got to the house, the more uneasy he felt. Yet something compelled him forward, an invisible pull he couldn't resist. When he reached the door, it opened before he could knock. A tall man in a black suit stood there, his expression neutral, but his eyes unnervingly intense. "Mr. Carter," the man said in a low voice, bowing slightly. "We've been expecting you." Nathan swallowed hard. "How do you know my name?" "All will be revealed," the man replied, stepping aside to let him in. The interior of the mansion was breathtaking, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with intricate gold filigree. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and something sweet and cloying that Nathan couldn't place. A grand dining room stretched before him, the centerpiece a long table laden with food. It was a feast beyond imagination. Roasted turkeys, glazed hams, steaming bowls of soup, towers of pastries, and platters of fruit so ripe they seemed to glow. At the head of the table sat a woman in a crimson dress, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a river of ink. "Welcome, Nathan," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "We've been waiting for you to join us." Nathan glanced around the room. The table was surrounded by people, all dressed in formal attire, their faces pale and expressionless. None of them were eating, but their eyes were fixed on the food with a strange intensity. I wasn't expecting anything this grand," Nathan said, his voice trembling slightly. "Please sit," the woman said, gesturing to an empty chair near the middle of the table. "You are our honored guest tonight." Hesitant, Nathan took his seat. The man who had greeted him at the door poured him a glass of deep red wine, its surface swirling as though alive. "To new beginnings," the woman said, raising her own glass. The others followed suit, though Nathan noticed they didn't drink. Feeling the weight of their stares, he lifted his glass and took a sip. The wine was intoxicatingly sweet, with a warmth that spread through his body like fire. For a moment, all his unease melted away, replaced by a strange sense of euphoria. "Eat," the woman urged. "You must be starving." Nathan reached for a plate of roasted chicken, its skin golden and glistening. The first bite was heavenly, the flavors so rich and complex they seemed almost unreal. He couldn't stop himself, taking bite after bite, each more satisfying than the last. But as he ate, he noticed something strange. No matter how much he consumed, the food on his plate never diminished. The chicken remained whole, the mashed potatoes untouched. Even his wine glass, though he drank deeply, never emptied. "What is this?" Nathan asked, his voice shaking. The woman smiled, but her eyes were cold. "The feast of eternity," she said. "A banquet that never ends." Nathan's heart began to race. "I don't understand. What do you mean never ends?" "Here, you are always hungry," she replied. "And there will always be more to eat. Isn't that what you wanted? To indulge without consequence?" Nathan pushed his plate away, his appetite replaced by growing dread. "I need to leave," he said, standing abruptly. The woman's smile faded. "I'm afraid that's not possible." The other guests turned to him, their faces no longer blank, but twisted into expressions of hunger and despair. Their eyes were hollow, their skin stretched taut over their bones. Nathan stumbled back, his chair clattering to the floor. "What is this place?" he shouted. "This is your eternity," the woman said, rising from her seat. "You accepted the invitation. You took the first bite. Now you belong to the feast." Nathan turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the grand hallways of the mansion. The walls seemed to shift around him, the corridors stretching endlessly. No matter which way he turned, he couldn't find the exit. The scent of food followed him, growing stronger, suffocating. He heard voices behind him, low whispers that grew into a deafening roar. "You can't leave," they chanted. "The feast is forever." Finally, he burst into a room he hadn't seen before. A vast kitchen filled with steaming pots and sizzling pans. But the cooks weren't human. Their faces were grotesque, their bodies warped and twisted. They turned to him, their eyes gleaming with malice. "You'll make a fine addition to the menu," one of them hissed. Nathan screamed and fled, his lungs burning, his legs trembling. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually he found himself back in the dining room. The table was as he'd left it, the food untouched, the woman in red waiting patiently at the head of the table. "You cannot escape," she said. "The feast is eternal. Sit. Eat." Nathan collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Please," he begged. "Let me go." The woman's expression softened, but only slightly. "There is no escape," she said. "But if it's any consolation, you'll never be alone. The table will always be full, and there will always be more to eat." As she spoke, the other guests began to eat, their movements mechanical and desperate. Nathan watched in horror as their hollow faces filled with fleeting satisfaction, only to return to hunger moments later. The woman gestured to a seat. "Join us," she said. With no other choice, Nathan sat. The moment he touched the chair, the hunger returned, sharp and insatiable. He reached for his plate, his hands trembling. And so, the feast continued. Nathan's disappearance made the news, but no one ever found him or the ivory hall. The invitation was gone, and so were all traces of the mansion. Yet, deep in the woods, on certain cold, quiet nights, some say they can hear the clinking of cutlery and the faint echo of desperate laughter carried on the wind.